comment. I recognize not a particularly fun topic to end the class on, but that is the end of the lifespan, so that's how we got to end it. In late adulthood, we talked about this a little bit last time, but a lot of people have to start coping with this idea that, first of all, a lot of the people they love that are surrounding them either have died or are going to die soon, and that they themselves, have this impending death coming that they have to kind of start to resolve and deal with. So we're going to talk quite a bit about the grief process, both in terms of grieving the loss of someone else and also, facing one's own impending death and kind of the grief that comes along with that as well. We'll also talk very briefly. I'm definitely not an expert at this last part of some of the decisions that have to be made towards the end of life. There's, legal considerations, personal things, medical issues that all have to kind of be sorted out and decided on. One of the things I hope you take away from this class is that you really should be having these conversations and trying to make these decisions as early as possible. Most people put this stuff off until they're in late adulthood. And at that point in time, you might not be cognitively all there, right? You might be suffering from Alzheimer's or even just some of the primary declines we've talked about that will make it a lot more difficult to have some of these conversations and make some of these decisions. And then you're kind of pushing that responsibility off to the people around you, which can be very difficult for them. So as much as this stuff is not fun to talk about, you should try to have these conversations even now, even though you're, only in your 20s or younger. Where you can, be a little bit more coherent, and you can always change your mind as well. So if you talk to a partner, a child, a parent, and you say, this is what I want the end of my life to look like, and then 10 years from now you change your mind, then you can communicate that. Okay, first thing is just coming up with a definition of death, which may sound like, that should be something that's pretty simple to tell. But actually there are lots of cases where it can be difficult to determine if we should label someone as dead or alive, because there's kind of these intermediate states that we can talk about a little bit. And this area of study, in case you're interested, is called thanatology, which I think is interesting. So if you're struggling to remember that, just think of Thanos, right, who snapped his finger and killed off half the population or whatever. So Thano means death in, probably Latin or something. So thanatology is the study of death, dying, and grieving and bereavement. So in order to kind of understand what I'm talking about here with these different definitions of death, we can talk about a few cases that are somewhat famous that kind of signify this necessity to try to come up with an actual definition of death. An early sort of case that was really famous was in the 2000s. There was a woman named Terri Schiavo. Have you ever heard of her? I remember in 2000 I would have been in elementary school or something. So I have a vague memory of hearing about this stuff as it was happening, but I was pretty young at the time. But basically, so this was a case in the early 2000s. There was this 26-year-old woman who had a heart attack, and she was resuscitated. So she was basically died for, a minute or whatever, but was resuscitated with the little shock things that you see in movies and TV shows sometimes. But she was in basically a vegetative state. So her brain had lacked oxygen for a long enough time that she was essentially, comatose. And there was this whole controversy. It was in national news for quite a while where, I can't remember the specifics, I think her parents wanted to take her off of life support and her husband wanted to keep her on it. And so there was this whole legal battle back and forth trying to decide how to deal with the whole situation. And there was, kind of a lot of legal things that were going on. She, I think, was fairly wealthy and her income would have been passed to her husband. So I think he was actually, I might have had it backwards. I think the husband was the one who wanted to take her off of life support, and everybody kind of hated him because they thought he was just trying to get her wealth. Her parents wanted to keep her on, but there was some debate about what their motives were. So a lot of this brought out kind of this debate about what do we even, where do we consider calling someone dead versus alive? Because she had no function whatsoever. Her brain, basically only the parts of the brain that kept the heart beating were still functioning. She was on, a ventilation that was breathing for her. She showed absolutely no response to anything. She was completely comatose. So brain death is where you have irreversible, stopping of all the activity in the brain. And that's typically the standard that we use for defining death in most countries. So if someone's brain has completely stopped functioning to where the brainstem and everything else is dead and no longer functioning, then typically we would call that death in most cultures. But you can be, like I said, in a persistent vegetative state. That's the state that Terry Schiavo was in, where the entire cerebral cortex was no longer functioning. And that's, the cerebral cortex is the part that allows us to consciously experience the world. So if you don't have any activity in that cerebral cortex, then you're basically, all of your conscious perception has ceased to exist. But the brainstem is still active, so it's, keeping your body technically alive. So it's kind of almost like a state, like being a zombie a little bit. Again, you might see in like movies or things, except they can't even move because their motor function is also completely shut off. In some cultures, they base it more on like the heartbeat. So instead of focusing on the brain and the activity in the brain, if the heart stops beating, then they say that that's when the person has died, basically. We'll talk about a couple other kind of cases potentially later in the lecture that also get to some of these issues. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring up now that we have some controversy even in what to call death. Next topic. This is something I could have interwoven throughout, the quarter, but I thought it kind of fit best to just talk about this all at the end. And this is how we develop an understanding of death across the lifespan. Typically, very young children do not have a very good grasp or understanding of what death is. They typically tend to believe that death is a state kind of like sleep. So they can recognize that someone who is dead is no longer conscious or responsive, but they do not understand the permanence of that state. They tend to think that someone who's passed away and that it's temporary. So a young child, maybe in like early childhood, like 4, 5, or 6, if someone close to them passes away, they may often talk as if they're expecting that person to return sometime soon. So they might say, oh, when is grandma coming back? Or when am I going to see her again? So there's kind of this expectation that the death is temporary. A lot of the development of understanding death, though, depends on an individual's experience with death and the way that the people around them talk about it. Children who are, exposed to death at an earlier age and who have parents and siblings who are comfortable talking about it, they tend to develop a more mature understanding more quickly compared to those who maybe don't ever experience death until later, and whose parents and family, are think of it as a lot more taboo and don't really address the topic. Around 6 is when most children will start to kind of understand that permanence of death. They still at that point, though, around 6, they don't necessarily understand the universality of the idea that like everyone will die someday. So they might understand that someone who has already passed away is permanently gone, but they usually will not understand that they themselves are going to die someday, that their parents and the people they love and care about are going to die someday. So even though they get the permanence, they lack the universality piece of understanding death. And that lasts up until, like adolescence, early adulthood is when we start to kind of gain that universality a little bit. So we talked about this a little bit in the context of adolescence. Adolescents tend to have this attitude that they're like invincible. Part of that is due to the way that they weigh risk versus reward. So they tend to also hold this view that death is something that they should not be concerned about, that they're not prone to. So by young adulthood is when we really start to form a full conception of the idea that death is permanent, that it's universal, that all of us are going to die someday. But typically most young adults, especially in the US and in Western cultures, tend to have a lot of death anxiety. So it's something that we all avoid talking about as much as possible. And when we do talk about it, like right now, people tend to get very uncomfortable and tense, and it's not something we like to really address. That is not true of all cultures. So some cultures treat death as a much more like natural, common thing that they're willing to talk about more frequently. Some cultures have like entire celebrations that are set up to celebrate death and the life of the person who has died. So for example, in like Mexico and other similar countries, you might have heard of things like Dia de los Muertos, which is a day entirely devoted to celebrating the lives of people who have passed away before. Cultures who tend to have those kind of celebrations and those other cultural traditions tend to have a lot less death anxiety. So they don't, view it as so taboo to talk about. They're more willing to have those kinds of conversations early on. This is also a relatively new phenomenon that we have so much death anxiety. Prior to industrialization, we would have had a lot more experience with death. People would have experienced family members passing away at a much earlier age. It's something they would have, been face to face with. And so that death anxiety is a relatively modern thing that's kind of emerged probably in the last 100 years or so. Around middle adulthood, the awareness around death starts to shift. So, for most young adults, we're just avoiding the concept entirely. Around middle adulthood, which again, that's like 40 to 65, is when we maybe start to become more aware of it. We potentially have, for example, like parents who are passing away, or even, like peers or loved ones who are more likely to either die or be close to dying. And so that kind of forces people in middle adulthood to address the issue and to talk about it more than they might have in the past. And maybe not surprisingly, late adults tend to be the most accepting of death because they're the ones who are closest to it, and again, who are having the most experiences of people around them passing away. So when it comes to coping with the death of someone else, this is also true of facing our own impending death. One of the main kind of theories that addresses the process of this is from a woman named Kubler-Ross. So she came up with this idea of the 5 stages of coping with death, something you might have heard of before. And whenever she originally developed this theory, it was developed as a framework of looking at, addressing your own impending death. So if you got like a diagnosis of a terminal illness, you know that you have a very short amount of time left, then this is the process that she described that you might go through. But then since then, other people have applied it to also grieving the death of someone else who has passed away. So it seems to be kind of a similar process, grieving someone else and also grieving the fact that we will be passing away soon if we've gotten some kind of terminal diagnosis. So according to Kubler-Ross, most people will go through these 5 stages. Typically, most people will go through them in this order, but this isn't necessarily universal. Some people may skip some of these stages, some may go through them in a slightly different order, but this tends to be the most common way that people kind of deal with again, grieving either their own death or someone else's. So typically it starts out with just denial. So the person will, if someone else has passed away, they may be in a state where they essentially just haven't even realized it yet. Typically, this is going to be just in the days or maybe a week or so after the person has passed. Someone might be in such a state of shock that they just don't even internalize the fact that this person has passed away. So it's kind of almost similar to the way that children view death. Someone who's in that stage of denial, they may talk as if this person that has passed away is going to be coming back anytime soon. Obviously, for someone facing their own death, kind of same thing, they're in a state of denial. They don't accept the fact that they only have a short amount of time to live. Typically, the next stage is going to be anger. So during this stage, people are often looking for someone else to blame for either their own impending death or for the death of a loved one. And that can, often be expressed in anger. Next, there's often a stage that's called bargaining, which is where someone will try to, this is particularly true for people who are religious. Now, bargaining is usually sort of a conversation they're having with the God that they believe in. But even people who aren't necessarily religious may go through this bargaining phase where they're kind of, talking to the universe, basically saying, if I could just have one more day with this person, I would give X, or I would give whatever. I would, trade my own life for this person's life. So they go through the stage of almost like trying to figure out a way to get this person back, even though they're obviously gone and they're never coming back. Then they may slip into a state of depression. So during depression, they still aren't quite facing the death yet, but they're starting to show, that they're processing some of those emotions. They, will be overwhelmingly sad. They also typically will lack motivation. They may not be able to, do the normal things that they do in a day. Might have trouble getting out of bed, taking showers, just functioning basically. And then eventually, all of this will end in a state of acceptance, where they, accept, okay, this person has passed, or I am going to be passing soon. And they can start to really, truly deal with the emotions and process all of those. This whole process is extremely variable from one person to another, as you can probably imagine. But typically, Kubler-Ross found that most people, even if you're dealing with the death of someone very close to you, like a spouse, for example, that you could reach a state of acceptance within about 6 months to a year is kind of the typical time frame to get through all these stages in this process. But again, that's super variable. There could be someone who gets through this process in, a month or less. There could be someone who takes multiple years to get to a state of acceptance. So it's highly variable, but kind of the typical time frame, like I said, about 6 months to a year. So that's one of the main frameworks of looking at this grief process, but there's other sort of factors to consider as well. I feel like I'm skipping over some stuff. I'll make sure I didn't skip anything important before I go too far ahead. My staple's not functioning either, so my pages are kind of out of order here. Sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, I'm good. One of the most difficult forms of grief is losing a spouse. So you can think, typically the more distant the relationship is, the less struggle there is to that grief process. The closer the relationship is, the more struggle there's going to be. So with widowhood, typically you have someone who has been with a partner for an entire lifespan. In a lot of cases, maybe they've been together, 30, 40 years, seeing each other every single day, being very, intricately entwined and involved in each other's lives. And then that person passes away. That can be a very profound, difficult loss to accept. Typically, women are most likely to be widowed because, as we talked about last time, women have a longer lifespan. Women on average live to about 81, whereas men live to about 75 or 76. So it's much more common that the man will pass away before the woman. So then you have, about 34% of women over the age of 65 are widowed. So they've lost a spouse. Only about 12% of men over the age of 65 are widowed. So it's much, much more common for women to be in this state. And of course, there's all kinds of difficulties to dealing with that, right? So first you have just the initial sadness of the loss and, the grief itself. But then on top of that, you may have some financial struggles. So if the man was the one making, the majority of the money, providing finances, then that, you have loss of that can be very difficult to deal with. You also then have to adjust to filling in whatever role they were serving. So if you're a widow and your husband used to, do all the yard work or whatever, then now you have to figure out how to take on those roles and do kind of the work of two people instead of being able to rely on another person. And then, like I said, widowhood can just be particularly profound because there's that loss of someone that you typically spend your entire day with or spend a lot of time with. So there's just lots and lots of reminders every single moment of the day that this person is gone and they're not coming back. So widowhood is a particularly challenging form of grief. Kind of similar to the Kubler-Ross stage, there are other kind of, theories that talk about the grief process in a more broad way. So Kubler-Ross had those 5 really specific stages. Another framework that looks at it talks about the grief process as being in 3 stages. The first stage is avoidance, which is kind of similar to denial and bargaining, basically just trying to avoid even thinking about the topic. The next stage is confrontation. So that in Kubler-Ross's framework would be kind of like when we're going through the depression, we're starting to actually try to confront the fact that we've lost this person. And then the third stage is called restoration, which is where we start to, kind of fit this loss into our life. So the idea is that most people, if you've lost someone very close to you, you probably are never going to fully get over that. You're never going to go back to a state of normalcy that existed before the loss. But a healthy grieving process is where you can find a way to fit that loss into your life in a way that's healthy and that can help you move forward, basically. Some of the other, Go ahead,
Do
sir.
you know who came up with that one?
The three-stage one? No, I don't. I don't know if it's really, there's probably not a specific researcher. It's more of like just a broad process that a lot of theories kind of have in common and overlap. So, yeah. Good question, though. Okay, some other things that can affect sort of the grief process. These, again, might be obvious, but, whether the death was sudden or prolonged, and whether it was expected or unexpected. So typically, if a death is sudden and unexpected, then that is going to be the most challenging grief process in terms of what happens after the death, or from the death going forward. So this would, for example, be if you have someone who's young and healthy and maybe dies in like a car accident or something like that. So it's very sudden. It's not something that took time to unfold, and it's unexpected because it's again someone who's healthy. You weren't expecting this death to occur. So typically, if that's the kind of death that happens, then those stages of denial will last much longer compared to if the death is more prolonged and expected. So then that kind of delays the entire grief process and makes it a little bit more difficult to eventually get to that stage of acceptance. If the death is more prolonged and expected, so that would be, maybe you have a grandparent or something who's in their 80s or their 90s and they've been diagnosed with, a series of illnesses, and it's, kind of been this thing that's you're expecting it because their health has been declining. Then kind of the idea is that you really start that grief process before the person has even passed away. So once like they're kind of in this terminal stage, their death is impending, then you can actually start that grief process before the death happens. So then once the death does happen, then you can kind of get to that stage of acceptance a little bit sooner than you otherwise would. Again, these are all generalities, so everybody deals with grief in very different ways. So, everything I just said could be different from person to person. Some things that help resolve grief faster. Again, probably none of these are very surprising. One is giving yourself permission to feel the emotions and to feel the loss. A lot of people, again, especially in American society, tend to have this view that, maybe if someone close to you passes away, your boss only gives you a day or two off to deal with it, so you feel a lot of pressure to, get back to work or get back to school and, get back to normalcy. But it's much better to give yourself permission to, take the time that you need to actually process everything, process those emotions and feel it. Accepting social support is incredibly important. Again, maybe obvious, but a lot of people fail to do that. Whenever someone passes away, instead of, reaching out for help, they don't want to burden other people. So they tend to maybe kind of pull away from their relationships a little bit. Being realistic about the course of grieving. So like I just said, for most people, it's going to take at least 6 months or a year or even longer to really get to that point of truly accepting. So just being realistic with yourself that you're not going to get over this very quickly. It's going to take time. Taking time to remember the deceased person, and particularly to remember the things that you enjoyed about your life with them or your time with them, is very important. And then also giving yourself permission to invest in new relationships and new activities. So a lot of people, if they've lost someone close to them, they may feel like, you're dishonoring them if you move on to someone else. Like if you've lost a spouse, for example, you may feel like it's dishonoring their memory if you move on to try to date other people. But it actually can be very healthy to try to form new relationships that can often help with that grief process as well. Okay. So, in terms of planning for one's own death, again, there are lots of aspects that need to be considered. One, which again I have not a lot of expertise in, so I'm just going to say this, very vaguely and broadly, are the legal aspects. So there's things like, writing a will, trying to figure out what will happen with all of your physical belongings, who will those go to, things like life insurance, etc. There's also things like advanced medical directives, which basically give, doctors directions about what you want them to do if you're ever in a state where, really tough decisions have to be made. So if, for example, if Terry Schiavo had an advanced medical directive then it might have given doctors instructions about whether, if she's in a vegetative state, would you want to be taken off of life support, or would you want that to be prolonged as much as possible? So you can actually designate that ahead of time. Designating what's called a power of attorney. So a power of attorney is another person that you basically give the permission to make all those decisions for you. So you might say, my spouse is going to be my power of attorney, or maybe a child or something like that. Then that person, if you get into a state where you're in a coma, or even if you just have severe dementia or something where you can't make decisions for yourself, then that power of attorney now has the legal right to make decisions for you. So again, those are all things that most of us don't want to think about or do very early on, but they're much better to do them now and think about them now. Maybe not even necessarily for yourself, but if you have like parents who are getting older, then having conversations with them about how they want to handle all these aspects might be important, because if you don't have those conversations now, you're probably going to be put in a position eventually where you have to make those decisions anyways, but you're going to be doing it without the benefit of being able to have a cognitively coherent conversation with them, because they might not be in a state where they can have those conversations. So something that's very difficult, but it's like one of those things, if you just take an hour of awkward uncomfortableness now, it'll save you weeks and months, years of headache down the road. So I talked a little bit about medical aspects as well, so that would be, like that power of attorney, people who can make decisions for you. There's also things like DNRs, which means do not resuscitate. So again, if you have someone who's elderly, who is maybe at risk of having like a heart attack or something like that, you can have a DNR for them, which means that if they do have something that puts them in a vegetative state, you're not going to resuscitate them or try to bring them back. There's also, of course, personal aspects. So these would be things like resolving relationships. A lot of times people who get into their elderly years, especially if they're given some kind of terminal diagnosis, they may decide like, okay, I've had this grudge against a sibling for years. I really would like to resolve that so I can pass away peacefully. Those kinds of personal decisions as well have to be made. I think that was all I wanted to say about that. Okay, we kind of briefly started to touch on hospice last time when we were talking about different living arrangements. But this is another potential decision that might have to be made of, maybe moving a loved one to hospice if necessary. Hospice is basically kind of an alternative medical approach where essentially the focus is on ensuring quality of life for the time that's remaining. So most people who are in hospice, they are there because they've been given some sort of terminal diagnosis. Maybe they have, like cancer or something like that, that is not curable and is not responding to any kind of treatment. So it's pretty much guaranteed that they have a very short amount of time left to live. Then in those cases, someone might make the decision that they don't want to try to prolong their life. They don't want to spend a ton of money and, do chemotherapy and all these things that are maybe going to ruin the quality of their life, but prolong their life. Instead of that, they just want to focus on quality. So they've accepted, okay, I'm going to pass away, but the remaining weeks, days, months that I have left, I just want to be comfortable. I want to be surrounded by my family and people that, love me. And that's the main thing that I want to focus on. So hospice is really kind of designed for that sort of scenario or situation. So it tends to be also more cost effective than treatments that prolong life. So again, if the choice is, do chemotherapy, which is going to make me lose my hair and make me nauseous all the time, make me super uncomfortable, and it's going to cost however much money, versus, put me in a bed with some pain medications maybe to keep me comfortable, then a lot of people will make that second choice. Is there anything else I want to say about hospice before I move on to the next thing? I guess here's some numbers. So there's about 6,000 hospice programs in the country currently, which serves about 1.2 million patients. About 67% of those have cancer. That's usually the most common reason that people end up in hospice. Okay. Almost at the end here, last couple of topics. kind of related to hospice in that idea of like, do we necessarily want to invest a lot of time and resources into prolonging life if the quality of that life isn't going to be great? Are these concepts of what's called voluntary euthanasia, or sometimes this is also referred to as assisted suicide. The first state in the U.S. that allowed something like this was actually Oregon. They passed a law that they called Death with Dignity. Do I have the year for that? I think it would have been sometime in like the 2010s maybe, is when this law was passed. There's kind of a high-profile case in 2014 that brought a lot of attention to this. You guys may have heard of that. There was a woman named Brittany Maynard who was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer in her 20s in 2014. And she basically made the decision, so this was a very aggressive brain tumor. Doctors had told her, like, there's not really anything we can do to cure this, and this tumor is going to grow and spread. And if it does, here's all these, ways that your body and your health are going to start declining. So she made the decision that she did not want to go through all of that. Instead, she wanted to basically take her own life in a way that was medically supervised, try to do it in a way that's safe and that's respectful to everyone around her. Again, there was kind of a lot of national controversy about it. She ended up in national headlines. There were a lot of people who thought she shouldn't do this because she's only in her 20s. And I believe she ended up going through with it eventually. So she moved to Oregon to, take advantage of this law, because at that time, I think Oregon was the only state in the country that allowed it. Since then, there have been other countries. I can't remember, I talked about this in another class, and I can't remember if we decided if Washington allows assisted suicide or not. Does anybody happen to know off the top of your head? Okay. I don't remember. I know there's been at least a few other states that have legalized it, but not very many. So just a couple things to know about these laws. So typically someone, in order to receive assisted suicide, there's a huge number of hurdles and challenges that they have to go through. So there's a lot of regulation put on this. So in order to receive it, first of all, you have to be diagnosed with a terminal illness that is incurable. And I believe there's even a number you have to have 6 months or less to live, according to at least 2 different doctors. And then there's all these steps you have to go through. So you have to request it multiple times. They have to verify that you're cognitively sound, that you can make decisions for yourself. So someone, for example, who has Alzheimer's or dementia, they almost certainly would not be able to use this, because if they're progressed enough in their disease that they only have 6 months to live, then they probably are not cognitively able to make these decisions. So it's a very small, narrow number of cases that would even be considered to allow something like assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia. And then even if you meet those criteria, like I said, there's a whole number of steps that you have to go through to actually get approved. Once you get approved, you get a prescription basically for a pill you can take that's a lethal dose. And you also have to be able to give yourself that pill, so no one else can give it to you. The doctor themselves won't put it in your mouth for you. So if you have any kind of motor issues that would stop you or prevent you from being able to feed yourself, you also would not be able to use this, because you have to be able to take the pill yourself, basically. So there's, probably not difficult to imagine a lot of controversy about this particular law, if it's something we should have nationally. There are other countries, I think Canada allows assisted suicide in pretty much the entire country. I think a few other European places have assisted suicide that's less strict than what we have in the states that are legal in the U.S. So people who argue for this typically say that, someone who's at a state where they want assisted suicide, if you don't provide it to them in a way that's medically safe, then they're probably going to find a way to do it themselves anyways. That allowing them to do it basically gives them, a safe alternative, that they can often do it in a way that's more peaceful and harmonious with the people who love them. Usually people who take this option, they want to be surrounded by their loved ones when they finally take the pill. So that's, maybe better than going off by themselves, committing suicide in some other way. People who argue against it, one of the main arguments is kind of a slippery slope argument, that if we allow voluntary euthanasia, then there may be cases where someone is coerced into doing it when they don't want to. There may be doctors who basically take advantage of this because they don't want to deal with, trying to treat patients who are terminally ill. It seems though, in any case where it's been legalized, that does not happen. So, yeah. Death with dignity, that phrase, just so you know, so it's the name of the law in Oregon, but it's also a phrase that's used in other contexts to kind of talk about broader principles around how we deal with end-of-life care. Because again, most of the time in the US, in our main medical system, the focus is often on like, let's just keep you alive for as long as possible, even if that's gonna cost you a lot of money and you're gonna be in pain and suffering during those final years. Like the whole point is let's just keep you alive for as long as possible. So death with dignity is kind of just an alternative approach that includes things like hospice care, these, voluntary euthanasia programs. But it's basically the idea that people should have autonomy over, making these decisions about how they're going to die, rather than the government, making those decisions for you, basically. Okay, final topic for today, kind of related back to the idea of how do people face their own impending death. There's some new research where people are using hallucinogens to try to help people cope with, usually like a terminal diagnosis or something like that. One of the most common substances that's used in this case is what's called psilocybin. So psilocybin is a hallucinogen that's obtained from certain types of mushrooms. And, I don't know if you guys have heard of this being used in this context. It may be a little bit surprising. You might be thinking, like, how the heck could hallucinogens help you face death? But what researchers have found, first let me tell you kind of typically the way that this is done. There's two kind of approaches to using hallucinogens in this context. One is to have someone under the supervision of a professional guide, which is usually someone who's like a counselor, a psychologist, a therapist, something like that, who will administer a dose of psilocybin that's enough for someone to have like a full-blown trip, basically. So I don't know how much you guys know about hallucinogens, but basically someone who takes enough psilocybin, you can experience like full-blown visual and auditory hallucinations, and people have, these kind of like profound experiences when they're on psilocybin. So the idea is that someone does that under the guidance of a professional. And what happens for a lot of people during these trips when they're on hallucinogens is that they often have to face something that they fear. So if you have someone who's had a terminal diagnosis of cancer, they're terrified, they're very struggling to accept the fact that they're going to pass away soon, then when they're in this trip, they may have to face and confront that fear of death. And often what happens is what's called the disillusion of ego. So ego, if you remember, I'm trying to remember if we actually talked about this in this particular class, because I talk about it in so many other classes. But ego is essentially like our sense of self. It's our sense of identity. It's knowing and understanding that I am here and I'm separate from all of you. I'm separate from the classroom, separate from everything else. But it's also kind of like self-monitoring. It's the part of our mind that's constantly like maybe doubting and judging ourselves. And whenever people are on hallucinogens, particularly psilocybin, it kind of shuts down the parts of the brain that do that self-monitoring. And what happens then is people who are in these trips, they start to lose that sense of self as like a single thing, and they feel more like they are, kind of intertwined with all of reality. They're intertwined with nature, their being, their identity is not just contained in this one body, but it's, in the people around them and their communities, etc. So that ego kind of dissolves during this trip that they have. So you can maybe imagine how that could then help someone confront death, right? Like if I'm going to die, but I accept the fact that I am not just this person in this body right now, but I also exist in my children and in my friends and in the things that I've created in my life, then dying isn't that big of a deal because all these things are going to live on past me, and maybe, my existence will continue even though my body has stopped, my heart stopped beating or whatever. So they tend to view life as extending more beyond their physical self and therefore are more likely to accept death. So that's kind of the common way. I don't mean common necessarily, but whenever psilocybin is used to treat death anxiety, that's typically the approach that's taken. Another kind of similar approach is something called microdosing, which is where someone takes just a small amount of psilocybin. It's not enough to experience a full-blown trip, but it kind of makes people more at ease, more open to experiences, basically happier overall. And so some people might microdose during those last 6 months or whatever life that they have left, because again, it just increases quality of life, increases the chance that they will be more accepting of death. Okay. Any questions about death, grieving, bereavement, etc.?
I have one question.
Yeah.
Just about the assisted suicide. Like,
Yeah.
do you know how many people go for that? Like, just roughly?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me check, because I might have it in my notes. I don't think I do, though. And I don't have it off the top of my head. I know in the U.S. it's like a very small number. Yeah, I don't think I have any. I have like statistics about how many people support it and things like that, but no statistics about how many people have actually used it. So yeah, something you could probably Google very quickly and find out. But yeah, I know it's a very, very small number because there's a very few states that even allow it in the first place. And then, like I said, there's such strict criteria on who can use it. So yeah, not a lot. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question. But,
Yeah.
so they just let you get a little bit high before death?
So as far as legality of this, there's only, I think Oregon just recently legalized psilocybin to be used in this context. Most of the other cases where it's been done has been in like a research context. So it's, they've gotten permission to do studies using psilocybin, and only the participants in those studies are allowed to use it. So sometimes yes. But I've also,